Ever since the original reveal, there's been a lot of talk about the type of PC that will be required to run the new Microsoft Flight Simulator. The general consensus usually being that it will require a beast of a computer. However, that said, there's certainly been a number of hints all over the months that this might not quite be the case. After all, let's not forget that Flight Simulator will need to be able to run on an Xbox One. Well, some of the speculation about this can now be answered, as Microsoft have at last revealed the system requirements for the game. The short answer then is that no, Microsoft Flight Simulator will not require super high-end hardware, unless, that is of course, you want to run everything on a level of detail that matches the official footage. The somewhat longer answer raises a number of other questions, and we'll get to those further into the video after we briefly go over the system specs, so do make sure you hang around for these issues and questions, as this video isn't going to be entirely about the revealed specs. After all, Microsoft Flight Simulator finds itself in a very unique position due to its extremely heavy dependence upon a quality internet connection, something that the vast majority of games do not require. In fact, outside of streaming games, I can't really think of any other title that requires a constant 50 megabits per second in order to achieve max settings. It's a sticking point for sure, and an unusual one at that. So onto those system specs then. Minimum system specs are as follows. CPU, a Ryzen 3 1200 or an Intel 4460. GPU, a Radeon RX 570 or an Nvidia GTX 770. Minimum video RAM is 2GB, whilst system RAM is 8GB. Installation size, meanwhile, is 150GB, and yes, that's pretty large. Now, whilst the game has been confirmed that it doesn't require an internet connection, that basically there is an offline mode, you won't get all the additional benefits that streaming the data in actually has. So if you do want to use the streaming function of Microsoft Flight Simulator to get that improved scenery, then you'll need a minimum of a 5 megabit connection. So all in all, those are pretty reasonable requirements. That said, official minimum specs for any game can often mean a lot of different things. For Flight Simulator, there's no telling what the final visuals or performance will be like on this level of hardware. However, we do know that it will be playable. For recommended system specs, the CPU is a Ryzen 1500X or an Intel i5-8400. Graphics card is a Radeon RX 590 or an Nvidia GTX 970. 4GB of video RAM and 16GB of system RAM are recommended, and the internet connection for recommended specs is 20 megabits per second. Now, I suspect that the majority of players will likely fall somewhere around the recommended specs here, or a little higher. The recommended Nvidia graphics card, after all, is around 5.5 years old. Again, we don't know what performance levels to expect from the game here, or what it will actually look like, but I'd imagine we're looking at pretty good visuals and pretty good performance at this level of hardware. Do keep in mind that this is way above the hardware on an Xbox One, although due to the specialization of console hardware, it's not too unreasonable to speculate that the Xbox One will perform around this level, or maybe a little better. In short, anyone with this level of hardware is likely to be in a good place. Unlike most game developers, Microsoft have revealed an additional tier of hardware requirements. This is what they class as the ideal spec, which I can only assume would mean the required hardware needed to match the level of performance and graphical quality that they demonstrate in their official videos. For this then, a Ryzen 7 Pro 2700X or an Intel i7 9800X, a Radeon 7 or an Nvidia RTX 2080, 8GB of video RAM and 32GB of system RAM. Also, there's that 150GB of install space again, but this time preferably on an SSD. Now, the real kicker for many people here is going to be the 50 megabits per second internet connection. Now, I really do feel that the hardware requirements here really do explain themselves. Whilst there's no visual clue as to what minimum or recommended specs actually look like in terms of game performance, it's nonetheless fair to say that these two levels of system specs are generally lower than what many people were expecting. I think it's also worth mentioning that it's likely the game will look pretty darn good on the recommended specs, and my reason for saying this, well, Flight Simulator is also being designed to run on the Xbox One, and they certainly won't want it looking like minimum settings on that platform. After all, this is a Microsoft game, and they will want it to be a good showcase for both their software and their hardware. But meanwhile, the ideal specs are certainly very interesting for a number of different reasons. First, Microsoft are being very clear here that whilst the game would work on older hardware, if you want the best performance, then you will require the latest hardware, or very close to it. Second, in my opinion, this is the most important aspect, there is that 50 megabit per second internet connection. So for a lot of people, that won't be an issue. Many people out there have 80 megabits per second, for example, and a good number of people have internet connection speeds 10 times higher than that or more. However, for a lot of people, the internet connection is going to be an issue. Unlike hardware, the internet speed isn't something that can just be changed. Taking a look at speedtest.net, we can see the global averages for internet speed listed by country. So, the top 59 countries in the world for internet connection meet or exceed these requirements, with Jordan sitting at 59 on an average 50 megabit per second connection, and Singapore sitting at the top with an average of 197 megabits per second. The thing with taking averages though is that, as we all know, average doesn't necessarily include everyone. The UK, for example, here apparently has an average internet connection of 66 megabits per second, however my own connection is far closer to 30 megabits per second. Australia, meanwhile, has an average connection of 43 megabits per second, with many Australians actually getting far, far lower than that. So, how much of an issue is this actually going to be? Well, Asobo Studios have stated that the game will automatically adapt on the fly to available bandwidth, and that means that when the bandwidth is available, the quality will improve, and when less bandwidth is available, the visual settings will drop down. So this, in principle, is not too unlike how video streaming services work. The real downside to all of this is that for the most part, internet speed is an area that is completely outside the control of the player, but the upside is that the game can accommodate and adapt for this. Keep in mind that Flight Simulator does employ a method to help mitigate slower internet connections, and one of these is the game can build up a cache of data. The more you fly over an area, for example, the more data of that area will be downloaded. So even on slower connections, by the time that you have flown over a particular route multiple times, you'll likely end up with the highest quality settings available for that area. Additionally, in an interview with La Nation, Asobo Studio mentioned that the possibility of downloading an area beforehand. If you fly there often, for example, you could set the route and the game would then download all that data ahead of time, and that would mean you wouldn't need a large amount of bandwidth to actually do this. Now, I haven't seen this mentioned elsewhere from Asobo Studios, only in that one interview, but I would assume that the fact that this is directly from the developers, that there is truth to it. So the bottom line for all of this, the takeaway message is that yes, Microsoft Flight Simulator will be a very demanding game that requires the latest hardware and a fast internet connection. However, that appears to be the requirements in order to max everything out. And let's be fair about that. The latest hardware is often required to max out the latest games, so that really isn't a new thing. Ultimately, it seems that 5-year-old hardware will be capable and more than capable of doing a good job with running the game. Flight Simulator will also be able to run on the Xbox One, and it really does seem then that for the most part, Flight Simulator is going to be very flexible in terms of how well it can run and how well it can perform. It means that essentially it will be far less demanding than some have feared, placing it in a position where it will be available to a pretty wide range of users with the ability to function on a broad set of quality options. Ideal then for both the casual simmer as well as the pro user. However, at the end of the day, all of this does raise one more question. What does it mean for VR? It will seem very likely that hardware requirements for VR, if and when VR becomes a thing, are going to be extremely high. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.